Welcome to this podcast of Super Special Kids and Cake. Yes, cake. I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Navigating Communication Services and Supports for Your Young Child with Autism, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.com.
As you know, every week we introduce a super special topic. These topics concern things that excite or aggravate us about trends in the field of special education. We may have some ideas that others don't always agree with, but we really do enjoy discussing them. Today we're joined by our super special guest, Susan Berkowitz. Susan has been a speech and language pathologist for more than 40 years, during which time she has concentrated predominantly on augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. She has worked for more than 45 years with children with autism. Susan's clinical experience has included public and non-public schools, non-profit community agencies, residential settings, and her own private practice. Susan is also the author of the wonderful book, Make the Connection, a practical guide to parents and practitioners for teaching the nonverbal child to communicate with AAC.
So, Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
And we're so pleased to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start out with a question, if I could. So it says on the title of your book that you work to teach nonverbal children to communicate. What kind of children are nonverbal?
There's a whole wide variety of kids who are nonverbal. Of course, as we know, there are many, many children with autism. The estimates are somewhere between 35 and 40% of children with autism are nonverbal or minimally verbal. There are children with any wide variety of disabilities, motor disabilities, like apraxia, genetic and chromosomal disorders that cause a child to be nonverbal. And of course, there are any number of acquired disorders that can lead to loss of speech.
And Susan, when we use the term alternative and augmentative, what do we mean by those two different terms?
So alternative means something other than speech. So we're looking at communication modes that don't require verbal output. Augmentative is for those folks who have speech but may not have sufficient language to meet their needs or may be unintelligible much of the time and need a repair strategy. So those are the two pieces.
Great, that's very helpful. So tell us a little bit about what you do as you work with children who are nonverbal with a variety of diagnoses.
Well, one of the places we want to start is by making sure that we give the child a communication system that is going to work to meet all of their communication needs. We don't want to be too limiting. We want to make sure that they have the vocabulary that they need. And to that end, we tend to use high-frequency words that are the building blocks of language. We look at those words that we use the most, and we call them core words. And there are relatively few words, despite all the hundreds of thousands of words that we know, that we use for most of what we say. And so we know that if we can give children those words, it will help them to be able to communicate in a wide variety of contexts. We want to make sure that we have a system that works for them, that they can access physically, visually, and language-wise. We want to make sure that the people around them know how to be good communication partners, how to encourage communication, how to teach it without demanding it or constantly testing. We want to make sure that partners know how to model use of the communication system. Children learn by listening to models of people talk around them. And so people don't realize that when we want a child to use pictures to communicate, that's something that they've never experienced. They haven't seen other people using pictures to communicate. And so they need those same kinds of models that we give verbal kids by talking to them all the time. And so we want to train the people around them how to do that.
That sounds very important. Maybe you can explain to us why a child might need augmentative and alternative communication. It's easy to understand for children with cerebral palsy whose motor skills keep them from talking. But what about a child who has, say, autism or Down syndrome? Why would they need an alternative or augmentative system?
Well, again, many of those children with autism just never learn to speak. And I'm not sure that we entirely know why. Some of them do have apraxia, which is a motor speech disorder that gives them difficulty with forming the speech sounds with their articulators, their mouth, their tongue, and that can be difficult. But for a lot of kids, we're not quite sure why they don't develop speech, but they don't. And we know that communication is an essential need for us as humans. It's the most unique thing that we do, is having language, and we're all social beings. And children with autism can be very social beings, and they need to be able to communicate not just their wants and needs, but how they're feeling and what they like and don't like, and build relationships with the people around them. So it's very important to give them a way to communicate beyond what they can do with gestures or facial expressions or screaming, and those kinds of things that we also get for communication.
Don't we? I just have one other question for you, Susan, and that is, what do you say when a parent says to you, "Oh, I don't want you to use AAC with my child because then he'll never learn to talk"? What if the parent holds out the hope of learning for a child who's not afflicted with cerebral palsy, let's say?
And I get that an awful lot from parents. Fortunately, in recent years, there is actual research that supports what those of us in the field have known for many, many years. We used to just have sort of anecdotal evidence by seeing children who we taught signs or to use pictures, who had some verbal potential and would start talking more. And we know now, again, with research and evidence, that use of augmentative communication does not hinder the development of speech, and in fact, it actually promotes it. It stimulates something. We're not sure what the mechanism is, but for a child who has any verbal potential at all, using augmentative communication consistently will actually promote speech development, and so it's actually a good tool to use.
And I've seen with the children I've worked with, there was a 3.5-year-old, and he was given a very simple device, and it was actually an iPad app. I think it's called My Very First AAC, and how delighted he was when he could tap the button, and in a little boy's voice, he would say, the sound was, "Come here, please," and his grandma would come rushing to him and give him a big hug.
And that's exactly what we want to see. And children are delighted when they discover they can control their environment. Communication is all about power.
That's for sure.
Our super special question for today, Susan, is how do you know which AAC system to use?
Well, it's interesting because an AAC system is actually a compilation of strategies and techniques. We rarely use just one thing. None of us only use speech to communicate. We all use gestures and body language and facial expression. And an AAC system is similarly made up of lots of different components. And so we want to take a look at the child, the communication partners, all of the different environments that child is in, what kinds of skills does the child have in terms of their motor movements, their vision, their language skills, and then do a full evaluation that gives us information about what kinds of things are going to work best for this child. And then we want to make sure that we have all of those things in place, and they may be different. An example I often use is a young woman I knew here in San Diego with cerebral palsy, with very, very limited speech, very unintelligible. She used a high-tech dynamic display communication system most of the time. However, and she could give speeches with it in front of large groups of people. She was very, very competent. She also had just an alphabet board, and when she was communicating with her husband, who knows her very well, very frequently just points to a letter, and he knows the word that she wants. Similarly, she had a book with high-frequency phrases that she used often when she was talking to people, and she would use that. So we want to make sure that we have all of the pieces that are going to fit the various environments and partners that the child has and meets their needs in terms of how many pictures can they see and access, how many words can we give them, and what kind of a system is most sensitive to their needs. And that may be a variety of things. Parents are often looking for the high-tech, slick, sleek things that everybody has that gives them the best access, and we love those. Those are fabulous. There are also, however, some very robust communication books that work beautifully and open up the world of communication for children. So we don't want to forget those as well.
And I think also remembering that it's sort of graded, like you don't go immediately to those high-tech sort of devices that you would, there's a training process and a learning in the same way that speech develops in a sequence, that language develops in a sequence.
Well, language develops in a sequence, but we often do go straight to those high-tech devices. Actually, one of the mistakes that we make sometimes is starting out with the low-tech or the no-tech and building up slowly. And frequently what that does is actually make learning harder for children. If you ask them to find where the symbols are in one system and they learn that visual display, they learn the motor patterns that they need, and then you say, okay, now you're ready for something more complex, you've moved things around on them. Now they have to find the symbols in a different place. They have to learn a different motor pattern. And so when we go through what we think should be, and we now know isn't, a hierarchy of pieces of the system, we actually make learning more difficult and we make the process longer for a lot of kids. And for a lot of kids, particularly those with the most physical difficulties, those high-tech systems are the only ones that they really, truly can access. So we sometimes do, though, straight for the biggie.
Well, that's a great point. Also, I think there's some research that's come out recently that suggests that the voice output devices are really very effective, particularly for eliciting speech from previously nonverbal kids.
Yes, a lot of kids, just touching a static picture on a piece of paper just doesn't do it for them. They don't get the connection. And sometimes that's a matter of how we've taught them. But for many, many students, hearing the voice output, being able to sound like somebody else makes all the difference in the world. I had a young man who received a high-tech device many, many years ago, and the first thing he did was to go to the keyboard and type out, "Thank you, now I can talk like everybody else."
Yeah, and there's some work going on to try to match voices to the person who's speaking, so a child doesn't have to speak with an adult voice and so on.
Yes, for many years the voices were horrible sounding, and I know many adults with cerebral palsy who resisted using them because they sounded terrible. And now having children's voices is wonderful.
It's great. It's great.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was really helpful for our listeners. Granny Rhea and Susan, what is the thing for this segment that makes us go, aargh? What's it for you, Susan?
There are a number of pet peeves. One of the many, there's so many misconceptions in the field. And some of them are finally sort of dying out as we get more research and more information. But one of the things that I see frequently is that people think that giving the child an AAC system, particularly a high-tech system or an iPad with an AAC app, will fix them, will cure their autism, will make them be able to communicate effectively right away, and if we just give them this thing, it will solve the problem. And unfortunately, that doesn't work. A communication system, whether it's an iPad or anything else, it's a tool. And a tool is only as good as the user knows how to use it. And the user doesn't know how to use it if they're not taught and not trained. And it's a little more complex than a hammer that you just hit a nail with. And so we really need to think of ourselves as teachers and partners in training children to use the system. And it's not until we have provided adequate input, teaching strategies, involved the child, motivated them to communicate, and taught them how to use that tool that they're going to start communicating. And in some cases, it happens quickly, and in some cases, it's a slower road. And we have to know that children move and learn at their own pace, and to know that we continue to provide the input and the teaching consistently and with fidelity in order for the iPad or the communication system to have an effect.
I remember when the iPad first came out and that sort of claim was made, but also thinking to myself, at least now there is a device that is affordable. Yes. And whether it's the iPad or any other kind of tablet, because, prior to that, they would cost, they still do cost thousands and thousands of dollars. So this made
over $8,000, most of them.
Something light, something accessible. And the other part of it too, many kids have iPads.
Yes.
And so there's something, I think, too, in terms of helping sort of the children feel that they're fitting in because they have their iPad just as their friends have one too.
Absolutely. When the iPads first came out, Apple was sort of taken aback at how the autism community took to them. And I don't think they were expecting this kind of a boon. And yes, finally, parents who could afford the iPad and the app didn't have to fight with the insurance companies, fight with the school districts, worry about how to come up with $8,000 for a dedicated device. And it has made a world of difference. Howard Shane, sort of the granddaddy of AAC, said way back when that iPads were a game changer, and they absolutely are, but they can't do it all.
And the problem is sometimes that kids do get iPads for other purposes before they get them for communication, and sometimes we have to sort of unteach them some of the things they've learned to do with the iPad.
Yeah, and I've been very, very firm, particularly with school districts, that an iPad that's used for AAC needs to be a dedicated device. You cannot have other apps on that iPad. The child needs to see it as their voice, as the way to communicate. And when you exit out of the communication app to play a game or do something else, you can't communicate while you're doing that. You've lost the ability to interact with somebody else. And so I always insist on a second iPad for those academic apps or the games or the fun things or watching videos. And then you still have that iPad for communication so that you can talk about those activities that you're doing and interact with the child around the video or the game or whatever it is that they want to do.
Auntie Donia, what's our eating cake for breakfast topic today?
So it's how can we utilize the AAC systems for fun, recreational activities? Susan, would you like to share more about that, please?
Absolutely. One of the ways to truly show children that communication is important is to engage them in the activities that they enjoy. It's not about teaching academics. It's not about getting them to say what we want them to say. It's about them enjoying the process. And so we want to look at the activities that are fun, that are engaging. And whether that's Something that we typically think of as fun, like blowing bubbles, which I have used gallons and gallons of in my career, or lining up Matchbox cars in a row across the floor. We want to make communicating fun. One of the most fun activities I've ever done with some students is playing Simon Says. I had a young man, and I've had any number of these students, who was very immobile. He used eye gaze technology to communicate. And his mother said he really wasn't interested in very much, and she wasn't sure that he was going to want to use a device because he really didn't play and didn't watch TV and didn't enjoy activities, and he could not engage in most of them. But he liked people. And so we said, all right, we're going to give him some control of people, and created a Simon Says page. And what's great about Simon Says is that you're always telling the people, Simon's telling the people to act, to do something. And those verbs are very important core words. So we're having the child practice words that are important for him to learn while giving him control. And we said things like stand up and sit down and dance and wiggle and make silly faces and do all sorts of fun things. And in the evaluation, within the first 5 minutes, he was having a blast. And the smile on his face was a million miles wide. And I've had lots of fun with Simon Says with lots of kids. And you can do it just with your child. It doesn't take other kids. It doesn't take other people around. Blowing bubbles, as I say, I have not found anybody of any age who does not have fun blowing bubbles. And again, blow, pop, catch, big ones, little ones, high, low, all of those are important words for the child to use. And all of those are lots of fun when you're playing with bubbles. Going to the beach. I live right by the beach. And in the summer, parents are looking for activities that they can do with their kids. And you can use AAC at the beach. You can take your pail and your shovel and dig and pour and build and wet or dry. Again, all of those are those high frequency words. And so you can use your AAC. Your iPad might not be very good at the beach. You might want to take your paper laminated against water communication book so you don't destroy your device. But you can take AAC anywhere and have fun with doing whatever it is the child wants to do. Just as I said before, make sure that if the fun part of what the child wants to do is an app or a game or a video on a device, that your communication device is separate so that he can still communicate whatever it is he wants to say.
I think that's a great point, Susan, that sometimes we want to take kids places where the iPad won't work so well, or the dedicated communication device, because it could get wet or it could get dirty. But you can still create an ad hoc communication device with just some pictures and some lamination, at which you can get at your local Kinko's, and still have fun with your child in a typical environment where he can share with other kids. I think that's really important for our kids who use AAC to have the opportunity to be out in the big world.
And one of the easiest ways is to just print out screenshots of your communication pages and laminate them. And then it looks exactly like the app or the software he's used to using.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I just wanted to mention one other thing. I don't know if you've ever come across this app, Susan, but it's called the Bubble Wrap app. Have you come across it?
No, I haven't.
Well, when you turn it on, the screen looks like a sheet of bubble wrap. And what you do is you pop the bubbles. And it's a great way to teach kids to point if they don't actually point. And you get the audible reinforcement with the pop of the bubble, and it, explodes a little bit on the screen. It's a great app. I recommend it.
I don't know how I've missed that one. I'm going to have to go download it.
I love that. Well, on that note, it is time for our favorite part, and it's our eating cake. So today...
Oh, I love cake.
Oh, good. So do we, Susan. Today's cake is a fruit cake with grapes on the top. There's a lovely cream in the middle and a lovely short crust pastry.
Oh, wonderful.
got two kinds of grapes, green ones and red ones.
I like
Wow.
them both.
Okay, let's take a taste.
That is very good.
Oh, that's
Very good. Thank you.
Yes, this was a really great cake selection. And another great selection is Susan's book, Make the Connection. We recommend it to any parent of a child who is nonverbal to learn more about how we help children who have trouble learning to talk and provide them with alternative and augmentative communication. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. And we thank you from all our super special families.
Thank you, Susan.
For having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Let's Talk About Super Special Kids and Cake podcast would like to thank our host, Sacred Heart University's School of Communication and Media Studies. We'd also like to thank our composer, Marty Eisenberg, our audio editor, Brent Morton, and our audio engineer and director of cake-based operations, Keith Stryovi.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a review.